Welcome back to Note Lab Mode. I have to say, you really sent over some fascinating research this time. AI during the COVID-19 pandemic, huh? Quite a topic.
Yeah, it is. It really shows how much and how quickly things were changing and how people were, really trying to find ways to apply AI to such a global crisis.
It's pretty remarkable to look back on, isn't it? I mean, just thinking about everything that happened in such a short period of time, and AI seems to have been right there in the thick of it in so many different ways.
Right. And the research you sent, it covers a lot of ground. Like, it's not just one specific thing. It's AI for diagnosing the bias, AI for predicting how it would spread, AI for developing treatments and vaccines. It's a lot.
Okay, so let's dive into all of that, shall we? For this deep dive, we're really going to unpack how AI was used during the pandemic, from those early days of trying to figure out who was sick to the longer-term efforts to manage the pandemic and its impact on, well, just about everything.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think it makes sense to begin with the early detection and diagnosis piece. How did AI help with figuring out who actually had the virus? The research mentions that analyzing medical images became a big focus.
Oh, it definitely did, especially when, testing capacity was so strained in those early days. The ability of AI to analyze things like X-rays and CT scans to look for those telltale signs of COVID, it seemed like it could be incredibly valuable, for making quicker diagnoses.
And were those early studies promising? Like, did the AI seem to be accurate?
There were definitely some encouraging results in terms of accuracy. The research mentions that some studies were reporting accuracy ranges like all the way from about 84% to 100% in some cases, which is, pretty impressive.
Those are pretty big numbers. What was it about AI that made it potentially so good at identifying COVID in these images?
Well, one of the key things is that AI can sometimes pick up on those really subtle patterns in the images that a human eye might miss, especially when you think about how much pressure medical professionals were under, just the sheer volume of cases they were dealing with, the potential for burnout. AI doesn't get tired. It can just keep analyzing those images.
Right, it's not affected by those human factors. And it's not just about seeing something, is it? The research also talks about AI being able to do this quantitative analysis, meaning it can provide more information than just a simple yes or no.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just, okay, this image shows signs of COVID. It's also, okay, how severe does the infection look? Is there evidence of pneumonia? How much of the lung is affected? That kind of thing. It can help to get a clearer picture of what's happening inside the body, which can be really helpful for making treatment decisions.
So, across all the research you looked at, what was the overall range of accuracy they were finding for these AI systems?
It actually varied a bit depending on the specific type of imaging used. For AI-assisted systems using chest images in general, the accuracy ranged from about 70% to almost 100%. But if you look at CT scans specifically, those showed accuracy between 70% and just under 99.9%. And for X-rays, those ranged from around 72% to just shy of 100%.
Okay, so that's a pretty wide range. Why do you think the accuracy differed so much between studies?
That's a good question. There are probably a few reasons. One thing is that the AI models themselves were probably different, different algorithms, different ways of processing the data. And then there's the data they were trained on. Some models might have been trained on, huge data sets of images from all over the world, while others might have been trained on smaller, more localized data sets. That can definitely make a difference.
Right, so the quality and diversity of the data used to train the AI can really affect how well it performs. Are there any specific studies that stand out in terms of showing the potential of AI for diagnosis?
One study that really caught my eye was one that used a deep learning model to analyze CT scans. They were trying to distinguish COVID-19 pneumonia from just regular community-acquired pneumonia, and they achieved a really high accuracy, like 93.2%.
Wow, so over 93% of the time, it could correctly tell the difference between those two types of pneumonia. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about the overall accuracy. They also looked at things like sensitivity, which is how good the AI was at correctly identifying true positive cases, and specificity, which is how good it was at correctly identifying true negative cases. And the AI performed really well on both of those measures, which is really important for making sure you're not missing cases or giving people the wrong diagnosis.
So in that study, it sounds like the AI was pretty much on par with, if not even better than, human experts at making those diagnoses.
Yeah, you could say that. And what's interesting is they also found that using AI actually increased the diagnostic efficiency for the pulmonologists involved in the study. So it wasn't just about replacing human expertise, but about augmenting it, making the process faster and more efficient.
Okay, so it was like a collaboration between the AI and the doctors. But then there's that other study you mentioned earlier, the one from the U.S. hospital, where the AI wasn't quite as accurate.
Right, right. In that study, the AI model had what's called an AUC of 0.70, which is a measure of how well it could distinguish between different classes. And its overall accuracy was actually lower compared to the radiologists who were also analyzing the images. So it's not like AI was this magic bullet that immediately outperformed humans in every situation.
It's important to remember that, isn't it? That technology is still evolving and it's not always going to be perfect right out of the gate. It's about finding those situations where it can be most helpful and where it can work best alongside human expertise.
Definitely. And that U.S. study really highlights the importance of rigorous validation, making sure that these AI models are thoroughly tested in real-world settings before we rely on them too heavily.
Absolutely. We also need to consider the potential for bias, right? I mean, if an AI model is trained on data that isn't representative of the whole population, it might not work as well for certain groups of people.
That's a really crucial point. The research actually mentions that, a lot of these early AI models for COVID diagnosis were developed using data sets that were, well, that had some limitations. Like some of them were pretty small, which can make it hard for the AI to learn effectively. And then there's the issue of evolving public data sets.
Evolving. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know how in those early days of the pandemic, information about the virus and how it presented was constantly changing, right? So the data sets that were available to researchers were changing too. What might have been considered a typical COVID case in, say, March of 2020 might have looked different by June of 2020. And if an AI model is trained on data that's, out of date or incomplete, it might not be as accurate.
That makes sense. And then you mentioned biases related to age.
Yeah, that was something that came up in a review of over 60 studies on AI for COVID diagnosis. They found that some of the data sets used to train these models had an overrepresentation of older patients, which could potentially lead to the AI being less accurate at identifying COVID in younger people.
So even if the overall accuracy looks good on paper, it's important to dig deeper and see how well it performs for different demographics. It's about making sure that everyone benefits from these technologies, not just certain groups. Okay, so we've talked about AI analyzing X-rays and CT scans, but were there other types of AI tools being used for early detection and diagnosis?
Yeah, definitely. Some researchers were exploring the use of AI to, analyze unusual symptoms that people were reporting, things that might not have been the typical cough and fever. And then there were systems that could automatically monitor how the virus was spreading, tracking cases and outbreaks.
And what about those infrared thermal scanners you see at airports and other places? Were those being used for COVID detection?
Yeah, those definitely became more common. They use infrared technology to detect body temperature, which could be a sign of fever, one of the symptoms of COVID. So they were being used as a way to quickly screen people for potential infection, without having to take everyone's temperature individually.
Right, so more of a mass screening tool. And the research mentions some specific examples of AI technologies that were actually cleared for use by the FDA?
It does. There's this company called Radlogics, and they developed an AI system that analyzes chest X-rays. It was initially cleared by the FDA to detect pneumothorax, which is a collapsed lung, but then they got clearance to use it for COVID-19 as well.
So it could help identify both pneumothorax and signs of COVID in chest X-rays? That's pretty impressive.
It is. And then there's another company called Tiger Tech, and they developed this device called the COVID Plus Monitor. It actually got emergency use authorization from the FDA to detect asymptomatic infections, people who might have COVID but aren't showing any symptoms.
So it could potentially catch cases that might otherwise be missed.
Exactly, and they were using AI to analyze the data from the device to make those determinations. It's really cool to see these technologies moving from the research phase into actual real-world use, making a difference in how we respond to the pandemic.
It is. And to help understand how well these different AI models were performing, the research often includes these tables that summarize the performance metrics for things like CT scans and X-rays.
Oh yeah, those tables are really helpful. They give you a good overview of the accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, and that AUC value we talked about earlier for each model. It's a nice way to compare them side by side and see which ones were performing best.
Okay, so we've covered the early detection and diagnosis piece, but there's another crucial aspect to understanding a pandemic, how it's spreading. That's where epidemiological modeling comes in, right? Trying to predict how the virus will move through the population. Did AI play a role there too?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, AI was used to adapt those classic epidemiological models like the SIR and SIS models to try and predict the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Those models that look at things like How many people are susceptible to the virus, how many are infected, and how many have recovered.
Right, those are the models that help us understand things like, when we might see a peak in cases, how quickly the virus might spread, how many people might ultimately be infected, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And AI was used to make those models more accurate and to account for the specific characteristics of the COVID-19 virus. It was a really complex undertaking, especially in those early days when we were still learning so much about how the virus behaved.
It must have been like trying to hit a moving target.
It definitely was. But AI's ability to analyze those huge amounts of data from all sorts of different sources, like epidemiological data, clinical data, data on how different treatments were working, it really helped to refine those models and make them more useful for predicting how the pandemic might play out.
And one review of the research you sent, it specifically identified 9 different articles that were focused on using AI models for pandemic predictions. So it seems like this was a pretty significant area of focus.
Oh, it absolutely was. AI was deployed really early on for forecasting on a global scale because it's so good at handling those massive data sets and identifying patterns that humans might miss. And this led to the development of some really novel prediction models that were used to inform public health strategies.
So using the power of AI to try and get ahead of the virus to anticipate what might happen next and plan accordingly.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about making predictions about the future. AI was also used to analyze data from people who'd already been infected with COVID-19. They're looking at their medical records, their symptoms, their demographics. AI could help to identify patterns and trends that could then be used to improve diagnosis rates and better understand how the virus was spreading.
So using the data we were gathering to constantly learn more about the virus and refine our understanding of it.
Precisely. And this information was then fed back into those epidemiological models, helping to improve their accuracy and make them even more useful for predicting future outbreaks.
It was like a continuous feedback loop, right? Gathering data, analyzing it with AI, refining our models, and then using those models to inform our response.
Exactly. And this approach was really helpful for optimizing those public health interventions we were talking about earlier. Things like contact tracing, social distancing measures, mask mandates, all of that. AI models could identify potential outbreak areas early on, which allowed for more targeted interventions. And they were also used to guide the distribution of resources like testing kits and eventually vaccines.
So using data to try and make sure those resources were going to the right places at the right time.
Right. And because AI could analyze different risk factors, it could help to identify which regions and populations were most vulnerable, allowing for more targeted interventions and, hopefully preventing some of those worst-case scenarios.
It's about using the data to make the most informed decisions possible, especially in those situations where you have limited resources and you need to make sure they're being used wisely.
Exactly. And as the pandemic progressed, so did the AI models. We started to see the development of these dynamic AI models for pandemic management, models that could adapt their strategies based on the latest information coming in and those predictive forecasts.
So as we were learning more about the virus and how it was spreading, the AI models were learning too.
That's the idea. The goal was to make those predictions even more accurate and not just for infectious diseases like COVID-19. The research suggests that this kind of approach could also be useful for predicting and managing other types of health issues, both infectious and non-infectious.
So the things we learned about using AI during the pandemic could potentially have a lasting impact on how we approach public health in general.
I think so, yeah. And what's really interesting is that AI was providing support at all these different levels. At the molecular level, helping with drug and vaccine discovery. At the patient level, helping with diagnosis and treatment decisions. And then at the population level, helping to track the spread of the virus and inform those broader public health strategies. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about one of the most urgent needs during the pandemic, finding ways to treat the virus and develop vaccines. It sounds like AI played a pretty big role in accelerating those efforts.
Oh, yeah, for sure. AI was really valuable in speeding up both drug repurposing, finding new uses for drugs that were already out there, and in identifying completely novel drug possibilities.
So it's sort of like two approaches, looking at what we already have and seeing if it can be used in a new way, and then trying to come up with brand new treatments.
Exactly. And AI was really good at both. Like with drug repurposing, AI algorithms could quickly sift through these massive databases of approved drugs, analyzing how they work at a molecular level and predicting how they might interact with the proteins of the virus.
That sounds much faster than the traditional way of developing drugs, which can take years, if not decades.
It is, and a great example of this is baricitinib. It's a drug that was originally developed to treat rheumatoid arthritis. But AI identified it as a potential treatment for COVID-19 because it was predicted to have these anti-cytokine effects.
Anti-cytokine effects.
Yeah, so cytokines are these signaling molecules that play a role in inflammation. And in some severe cases of COVID-19, there's this like massive inflammatory response that can really damage the lungs and other organs. Baricitinib was thought to potentially dampen that response.
So the AI was basically looking for drugs that could interfere with the virus's ability to cause that severe inflammation.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about repurposing existing drugs. AI was also being used to build these computer models of key viral proteins, like the main protease, which is essential for the virus to replicate.
Okay, so that's like creating a virtual version of the virus and then testing different drugs on it to see if they can stop it from working.
Yeah, pretty much. It's called virtual screening. And it allowed researchers to test thousands, even millions of compounds really quickly to see if any of them could bind to those key viral targets and potentially inhibit their function.
It's like having a super fast drug discovery lab inside a computer.
Right. And it's all thanks to AI's ability to process those huge amounts of data and make those predictions. And keep in mind, the research on COVID-19 was exploding at this time. New papers were coming out every day, new findings, new insights. And AI was incredibly helpful in just keeping up with all that information, processing it, and identifying those potential leads for drug development.
It's like having a research assistant who can read and understand thousands of scientific papers in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, something like that. And the research you shared mentions 9 different studies that were specifically focused on using AI to discover drugs for COVID-19. So it's definitely a hot area. And this approach of repurposing existing drugs using AI, it had some real advantages in terms of speed, because we already knew a lot about the safety profile of these drugs. And it was also more cost effective because you're not starting from scratch with drug development.
It makes sense to try and leverage what we already know and have, especially in a situation like this where time is of the essence. So having that existing biological information about these drugs was really important for those AI-driven repurposing efforts to work.
Absolutely. And, this really highlights AI's potential to revolutionize how we discover drugs for all kinds of diseases, not just COVID-19, especially as we're facing, these emerging infectious diseases and the threat of antibiotic resistance. AI can really accelerate the process and potentially help us stay one step ahead.
It's like having a new weapon in our arsenal for fighting disease.
Exactly. AI can help us analyze those massive data sets from preclinical research and clinical trials to predict how well a drug might work. And it can even help us identify completely new drug targets that we might not have even considered before.
So not just speeding up the process, but also opening up new possibilities that we might not have even thought of otherwise. Okay, let's talk about vaccine development, which was arguably one of the most impressive scientific feats during the pandemic. How did AI contribute to that remarkable speed?
Oh, AI played a critical role in that. It was used to predict potential vaccine targets within the virus, those parts of the virus that the immune system could recognize and mount a response against.
And that's what a vaccine does, right? It essentially trains the immune system to recognize and fight off a specific pathogen.
Exactly. And by using AI to analyze the genetic sequence of the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the structure of its proteins, researchers could identify those most promising targets for vaccine development, like, for example, the spike protein, which is the one that allows the virus to attach to and enter human cells.
Right, the spike protein was all over the news. That was the one that a lot of the vaccines were designed to target.
Exactly. And AI was really instrumental in helping researchers zero in on that target. And the research you sent mentions numerous studies that explored using AI in COVID-19 vaccine discovery at all different stages of the research process.
So it wasn't just one specific application, but AI was being used throughout the entire process of developing a vaccine.
Yeah, pretty much. And it really helped to accelerate the development of not just vaccines, but also treatments for COVID-19. And it also helped to make those clinical trials more efficient, designing the trials, analyzing the data, all of that.
It's amazing to think about how much faster things moved because of AI. I mean, typically, vaccine development can take years, even decades. But with COVID-19, we had multiple vaccines authorized for use within a year of the pandemic being declared.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? And AI played a big part in that. It helped with identifying those vaccine candidates, it helped with optimizing the trial designs, and it even helped to expedite those regulatory approvals.
And even after the vaccines were authorized, AI was still involved.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. AI was used to monitor those clinical trial data in real time, which allowed for those quick adjustments and ultimately faster approvals, without compromising on the safety or the effectiveness of the vaccines.
So making sure we were getting those vaccines out to the public as quickly as possible, but also making sure they were safe and they worked.
Exactly. And then AI was also used to optimize those vaccine distribution strategies. Figuring out how to get those limited doses to the people who needed them most in the most efficient way possible. It was a huge logistical challenge.
I bet. And the research actually estimates that around 20 million deaths were prevented globally in the first year that COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out.
Yeah, that's the estimate. And, there were obviously a lot of factors that contributed to that, but AI's support was definitely one of them. It helped to get those vaccines developed and distributed faster, which ultimately saved lives.
It's a pretty amazing testament to the power of technology, isn't it? When it's used for good.
It really is. And those tables you mentioned earlier, the ones that summarize the AI applications in drug and vaccine development, they really showcase all those different ways that AI was being used to make a difference. You can see the specific AI techniques and tools that were used, the outcomes that were achieved, and the impact that AI had on the timeline for developing those treatments and vaccines. It's really fascinating stuff.
It is. Okay, so we've talked about AI helping to diagnose COVID, predict its spread, and develop treatments and vaccines. But there's another big area we need to discuss. Contact tracing. Trying to identify and track down people who might have been exposed to the virus. Technology played a big role there too, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And AI was a big part of that. It was used to enhance those contact tracing efforts, making them more efficient and effective. One of the main goals of contact tracing is to identify those chains of transmission, figure out who infected who, and then try to break those chains by isolating people who might be contagious.
Right, to try and stop the virus from spreading further. And AI could help with that.
Yeah, in a few ways. For example, AI could analyze different sources of data, like cell phone location data, social media data, even credit card transaction data, to try and identify those potential contacts, those people who might have crossed paths with someone who was infected.
So it was like having a digital detective piecing together all those clues to figure out who might have been exposed.
Kind of, yeah. And AI's ability to process all that data and identify those patterns was really valuable, especially when you think about how quickly the virus was spreading and how many people could potentially be exposed.
Right, it would have been impossible to do all that manually. But then there was also this big push to develop those mobile apps for contact tracing. Were those using AI as well?
Many of them were, yeah. Like some of those apps would allow users to, share their health status, keep track of their symptoms, and then they would use Bluetooth technology to automatically detect other app users who were nearby. And if someone tested positive, the app could then notify those close contacts and advise them to quarantine or get tested.
It was like having a little digital guardian angels on your phone watching out for potential exposures.
In a way, yeah. And AI was used to power those notification systems, making them more accurate and reliable. And it was also used to analyze the data coming from those apps, to track how the virus was spreading, identify those potential hotspots, and inform those public health strategies.
So even if not everyone was using the app, it was still providing valuable data that could be used to understand and manage the pandemic.
Exactly. But, there was also a lot of discussion about how effective those digital contact tracing apps really were. Like, did they actually make a difference in slowing the spread of the virus?
I remember those debates. There were a lot of concerns about privacy, and I don't think the adoption rates were as high as some people had hoped.
Yeah, you're right. There were definitely some challenges there. The research actually suggests that the effectiveness of those digital contact tracing apps, or DCTAs, compared to traditional manual contact tracing methods was, well, it was kind of mixed. Some studies found that the apps, when used on their own, could actually reduce infection rates more effectively than manual tracing alone.
So in those studies, the apps seemed to be working pretty well.
Yeah, they did. Like, there's this one study from the UK that suggested that their app might have prevented a significant number of cases and even deaths. But other studies found that the apps weren't really any better than, traditional contact tracing methods. And it seemed like a lot of it came down to adoption rates, how many people were actually using the apps.
Right, because if only a small percentage of the population is using the app, it's not going to be very effective at detecting those chains of transmission.
Exactly. Some experts were estimating that you might need like 75% to 95% of the population using the app to really have a significant impact on controlling an outbreak. And that's a really high bar to reach, especially when you consider all those privacy concerns that people have.
And even beyond the privacy concerns, I think some people were just skeptical about how accurate the technology was. Like how reliable is Bluetooth for detecting close contacts? What if I get a notification that I was exposed, but I wasn't actually anywhere near that person?
Yeah, those were valid concerns. And the research actually mentions that even when adoption rates were lower, they still seem to contribute to a reduction in the cumulative incidence and mortality associated with COVID-19.
So even if not everyone was using the apps, they were still having some positive impact.
It seems that way, yeah. But the research also highlights some of those barriers to adoption that you mentioned, like, privacy concerns were definitely a big one, but there was also a lack of interest from some people, some skepticism about how effective the apps would be, and even distrust of the government's role in developing and promoting those apps.
It's a reminder that technology is only part of the solution. You also need people to trust and use it for it to be truly effective.
Absolutely. And, the research actually points out that those low adoption rates limited the app's ability to connect with nearby phones and accurately identify potential exposures. So even if the technology was working perfectly, if not enough people were using it, it wasn't going to be as effective as it could be.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you only have half the pieces. Okay, so it sounds like those contact tracing apps face some challenges, but were there any other ethical concerns raised by the use of AI during the pandemic?
Yeah, there were definitely a few, like, we were just talking about those privacy concerns related to contact tracing apps, but there are also concerns about other applications of AI, like facial recognition technology being used for lockdown monitoring, making sure people were staying home.
Right, that kind of technology can feel very intrusive, especially when it's being used by the government.
Exactly. And then there were also concerns about how the data collected by these AI systems was being used and protected. Was it being anonymized? Was it being shared with third parties? Those were all important questions that people were raising.
It's a reminder that even when we're dealing with a public health crisis, we still need to be mindful of individual rights and freedoms.
Absolutely. And, the research points out that those voluntary contact tracing apps, the ones that relied on people choosing to download and use them, they had their own set of limitations and potential pitfalls.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, because they were relying on those Bluetooth signals, which can be, kind of finicky, they weren't always accurate at determining close contacts.
So you could get false positives, like being notified that you were exposed when you weren't actually anywhere near that person.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you could also get false negatives, meaning you were exposed, but the app didn't pick it up. And then there were concerns about the potential for social stigma and exclusion, if people were identified by the app as having been exposed or having tested positive.
Right, it's like that scarlet letter effect. People might be afraid to use the app because they're worried about the social consequences.
Exactly. And the research points out that, those false positives were more likely to occur in densely populated lower income areas, which raised concerns about equity.
Right, because those are the communities that are often already disproportionately affected by health disparities. Okay, so it sounds like there were a lot of important ethical considerations to keep in mind when it came to using AI for contact tracing. But let's move on to another critical area. How AI was used to help manage healthcare resources during the pandemic, when hospitals were being overwhelmed with patients.
Oh, that was a huge challenge, wasn't it? Just trying to keep up with the demand, make sure there were enough beds, enough ventilators, enough staff. It was really stressful for everyone involved.
It was a crisis situation in many places. So how did AI try to help?
Well, one of the key areas where AI was used was in trying to optimize the allocation of ICU beds, those intensive care unit beds that were in such high demand.
Right, because when you have more patients needing critical care than you have beds available, you have to make some really difficult decisions about who gets priority.
Exactly. And AI was used to try and make those decisions more efficient and data-driven. Like, there's this one study that used what's called an artificial immune system algorithm to try and optimize a queuing model for ICU bed allocation.
A queuing model, like a model for managing the waiting list for ICU beds?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, how do you prioritize patients based on their needs and the severity of their illness, while also trying to minimize the number of patients who have to be turned away because there aren't enough beds? It's a really complex problem.
It sounds like it, and this AI model was able to help with that.
It did. The model's objective was to balance those admission rates, how many patients were being admitted to the ICU with the availability of beds, and to try and minimize those rejection risks, the risk of having to turn away patients who needed critical care. And when they applied this model to data from Italy during those early months of the pandemic, March 2020, it actually estimated the minimum patient rejection rates that they could achieve given the resources they had. It really shows just how much pressure the healthcare system was under at that time.
So using AI to try and make the best possible use of those limited resources and hopefully save as many lives as possible.
Exactly. And, this kind of approach wasn't limited to just ICU beds. Researchers were also exploring using machine learning in higher income countries to help with rationing those scarce resources, things like ventilators.
Right, because when there aren't enough ventilators to go around, you have to make some really difficult decisions about who gets access to them.
Exactly. And these AI systems were being developed to predict, things like mortality risk, how likely a patient was to die if they didn't receive ventilator support, how likely they were to need to be admitted to the ICU, all of that. The idea was to provide data to support those really tough allocation decisions.
So it's not about replacing human judgment, but about providing more information, more data points to help those healthcare professionals make those difficult choices.
Right. And the research suggests that AI might also be able to help with those early detection efforts, identifying patients whose condition is deteriorating before it becomes a crisis, and also with identifying new prognostic features.
Prognostic features, what are those?
They're basically characteristics or factors that can help predict how a patient's illness might progress, like, some biomarkers in their blood, certain patterns in